Welcome. I am the Chief Philanthropy Officer of Emancipet. We are based in Austin, Texas. So we operate a network of low-cost veterinary clinics in underserved communities. So we have 6 clinics based in Texas, and then we have another clinic in Philadelphia. We are also proud to offer the Emancipet New School, which is a program that offers a seminar series and individualized consulting for groups that are hoping to increase their sustainability and impact in animal welfare, ranging from spay-neuter to sheltering, all of that good stuff. So that is what we do. I started at Emancipet about 8 years ago after a career working in politics, and I have found that working in politics has prepped me, or did prep me very well for fundraising. They're very similar activities. They both involve building a relationship with the goal in mind of kind of a shared objective, advancing a shared objective, hopefully a shared objective, depending on the leader that you're working with in politics. So what we'll talk about today is why you need a seat at the table, the process for influencing local policy, and what you can do today to get started. And I just want to preface this by saying I know that a lot of you have probably been told by your board or your leadership, or just kind of heard it in general, that you should stay out of politics. I'm going to advocate for a different approach, one that says you should sort of lean in. That doesn't mean your organization has to be political, but you should be building relationships in that space so that when something does come up, you are prepared to deal with it, and you have some good kind of political capital with the decision makers in your community. And then finally, we're going to talk about what you can do today to get started with this kind of relationship building. So you guys have probably heard the saying, if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. We have all kind of heard this saying, and Emancipet has, in our own experience, kind of a great example of what that means. So early in Emancipet, in our history, we were pretty naive about political relationships. And things started to change very rapidly in 2009. So at that point at Emancipet, about 40% of our funding came from the city of Austin, and that was for targeted free spay-neuter. And during the recession in 2009, there was a need to put a bunch of stuff on kind of a chopping block and figure out what would be eliminated in order to balance the city budget. And so everything was thrown into there: parks, education, libraries, and of course Emancipet's Free Day program. And we had not built any political capital with the local kind of municipal decision makers. So we were in quite a bind. We were lucky because we had been working on fundraising, and we developed a database of people who had invested in Emancipet, and we were able to kind of spring them into action, have them start calling our council members, go to a town hall and have their voices be heard on the subject. But it cost a lot of expense, a lot of energy. It was a great grassroots moment for our organization, but it could have been a lot easier, and we could have not ever gotten on the chopping block if we had had some of these relationships in advance. So it was a very teachable moment for us, where we thought, okay, we need to do some kind of proactive relationship building so that we don't find ourselves in this situation again. Because sooner or later, something is going to come up in your work where you want to advocate for something, maybe more funding, maybe a law that would make your work easier, or you're going to want to advocate against something that would harm animals in your community. And so there are a lot of things that you can do to start to kind of proactively build these relationships so that you don't find yourself in the great Emancipet conundrum of 2009. So one of the things that you need to kind of wrap your heads around right away is that you are all subject matter experts. You are the best people in your community to advocate for the animals and for the pet owners in your community. And policymakers at the offices of whether it's somebody in Congress or a council member, and staff rely on subject matter experts when it comes to making these policy decisions, especially when a quick vote comes up. So you want to be the person that your council person calls when somebody submits or proposes a new piece of legislation or a new policy. You want them to think, you know who would have a good answer for this? Sarah over at the shelter. She'll know what I should do on this. And that's not going to happen unless you already have a relationship with them. They want to make good policy, but they need access to reliable information. And you want to establish yourself as the person who has that reliable information. You want to be the person who they reach out to consult. So for those of you who were just in my fundraising workshop, this will look familiar to you. And this is the major gift fundraising cycle. I also apply this to all fundraising. But basically, the gist is that you are putting a prospective donor through these steps as you're moving them towards asking for a donation. And this is the same kind of approach that should apply to relationship building with policymakers that you intend to advocate with when it's time to make a decision. So I'm going to review this cycle for you, and I just want you to think of it also in terms of cultivating or building a relationship with an elected official. So there's identification and qualification, that's figuring out who you need to talk to. Cultivation, that's the process of relationship building. Solicitation will eventually be when you make an ask. In fundraising, it's going to be for money. Here, it's going to be for action on a particular policy. And then there is stewardship, which is just sort of the thank you afterwards. And then you go back into solicitation, which is when you would make another ask. So we've kind of gotten this and distilled it down to a cycle that makes more sense in terms of advocacy. And that is to relate, educate, and advocate. And I want you to notice the most important process, or part of this process, but also the last part, would be advocate. So you start with relating, then you're educating, then you're advocating. You never want to jump straight to advocating in much the same way that you wouldn't with the donor, kind of show up at their door and ask for a gift right away before you kind of got to know them. I've heard in my time in politics, when people on the legislative floor will say, like, this guy just came and asked me for something and he hasn't even spent any time building a relationship with me. So it even works kind of internally. That's why they play golf together, so they can kind of court each other before they make a big ask or ask a favor from one another. So you will not have time to build a relationship with everybody in your municipality. So I recommend starting with the people who are most likely to work with you early on. And then if you have time, you can build a relationship with your entire city council and all your county commissioners and all of that good stuff. But you want to work with your issue leaders. So if there are people who in your council or your county, depending on who has the most kind of authority over animal issues, who are already showing an expressed interest in animal welfare affairs, that's a person to put on your list to build relationships with. And then newly elected officials. Those are the folks who haven't kind of built up their Rolodex of subject matter experts yet. So if you can get in front of them and show like that you're the right person for that job, that's a good thing. And you can figure out who these people are by reviewing their election websites, reviewing their personal and public social media pages. This is a big one because you can find out so much about a person from kind of looking at their personal, and it's never really personal with a politician. We all know it's sort of curated. But you can figure out like, okay, here's this guy and he has every picture he has is with his dogs. Or here's this guy and he is on a big game hunting trip in Africa. He may not be our guy. So you're kind of looking and figuring out who your people are that way. You want to review your boards, commissions, and subcommittees to find out which people are making the decisions on animal welfare issues. And you want to reveal articles written during the election and public comments. All of that stuff can be really informative, and going into a person's office to get to know them when you have sort of this backstory can be really helpful. So how do you go about building a relationship? You want to go to council and committee meetings and introduce yourself. Run into them at social and political events. You're not really running into them. You kind of research where they're going to be by following their page, and find a way to continue to bump into them. Connect on social media, so follow the council people that you're likely to want to build a relationship with via social media. And one of the things that I do is when I follow council members, if I see that they've done something that I'm excited about on a different issue, because I'm the individual who might be building a relationship with them, I'll send them a shout out and say, good work. Like, I loved your vote on this housing code thing, or whatever the case may be. That just lets them know that you're watching, but it also helps them have this kind of rare experience, I think, for many electeds of having praise, right? Like, how often does somebody call? Once people get their thing passed, they don't call and say, like, thank you, great work. So if you can kind of build some happy rapport that way and some good rapport with your members, that's a great thing to do. And then you're going to want to schedule an introductory meeting. So be mindful of the schedules of, when are they in session, when are they not, when is budget planning. That's certainly not a good time for people to call me. So that's probably true of your council members. And try and schedule an introductory meeting. And that meeting is just to go in and kind of establish yourself as their subject matter expert. When you get this introductory meeting, the format should be that you go in, you briefly explain what your organization does. You want to establish yourself as a subject matter expert. You want to talk about the size of your constituency. Always come armed with, we have this many followers on Facebook, we have this many donors in our database, we're in regular communication with this many people through our e-newsletter. You want them to know, like, hey, you may be new to this office, we've been around for a while, and we have a lot of people who have loyalty to us and who will kind of take their cues from our successes and the people who helped us get them. And then you want to offer to be a resource. The members of council or commissioners, whoever you're meeting with, are not, though they would have you believe it, actually experts on everything or very many things. They have staff members. Often they have multiple staff members who have multiple issue areas that they're focused on. And those folks are the ones who are kind of grabbing information and distilling it for them, offering them briefs. And you want to be one of the people that they grab that information from. So you should never ignore staff members when you're building relationships with your council members. Figure out who their chief of staff is. That's also a person you want to sort of court and have a relationship with. Don't turn your nose up at a meeting that's just with a staff person, because the staff people are the ones who are going to distill information often and pass it along to your the person that you're trying to advocate with. What if they don't do the thing you want them to? Like, are you then mean to them? Do you turn your back on them? Is the relationship over? And the answer is always no. Like, you say, okay, we didn't win on that one. Let's figure out what will work on the next one. So you keep that relationship going. And politicians get it, and they're used to having, kind of rough and tumble fights on the floor and then going out for a beer with their friend from across the aisle. So I think as long as you approach it professionally and have this sort of convey this kind of adult understanding that it's not personal, that it's about policy and it's about the things that you care about, and finding values alignment on that, then it's totally fine. So I don't know how to approach it, except that to be very professional about it. Then one of the things you can do, and Emancipet has done this at times, is not take a position, but continue to be a subject matter expert. So the end game may not be going in and saying, please vote yes on resolution X, but just going in and saying, here's some data, here's our experience, and not taking a position, but just having data, being a resource. I mean, at the end of the day, what you want from all of these relationships is that when Council Member B submits a resolution and Council Member A, who has a relationship with the organization, is like, how do I vote on this? That they call you and say, like, can you give me more background on this? So you can avoid kind of the direct advocacy, which can also get sticky with the concept of lobbying, by just being a resource and being the subject matter expert. Does that make sense? Okay. You can also, when you're in these meetings, these initial meetings where you're building a relationship, you can ask who else you should be talking to. So once you build a rapport with a council member, it's a great thing to be like, hey, who else do you think is kind of feeling the same way on this issue? And they will very often say, oh, you know what, call so-and-so, he owes me one, or I'll set up a meeting with this councilwoman, she is a big softie for this issue, or whatever the case may be. So that's just something to keep in mind as you're building those relationships. After the introductory meeting, you should send a handwritten thank you note. Again, so much of this overlaps with fundraising. So if you're a fundraiser, you probably already have some skills built around the concept of advocacy without realizing it. But send a note to both the policymaker and the staff as quickly as possible, and it should be personal and meaningful and all of that good stuff, even if it was just thank you for taking the time to learn about our organization. You should then monitor the council agendas, work sessions, that sort of stuff, and look for opportunities to be a subject matter expert. So look for places where you can call and say, hey, I saw this thing is coming up, do you need our help with it? You want to highlight their good work to your constituents. So anytime that we get help, whether it's some discretionary funding or a vote on that's gone the way that we want on something, then we are very public about that and about heaping praise on that person. So for instance, in Houston, there's a council member named Robert Gallegos who was instrumental in getting our Emancipet clinic there. He also gave us discretionary funding, and every time he gets a chance, he sings our praises to the world, and we do that right back at him. It is just a love fest between all of our social media. But we want him to know that we appreciate it, and we want other council members to see that it won't go unnoticed if they do decide to support us in whatever way. We also like to do a friendly heads up if we know something is stirring up in the community. Often the animal welfare folks will know it before the council members do. And if we know that there's going to be a pitched battle on something that might have implications at the policymaking level, then it's great to use that opportunity to do a heads up to the people you're building relationships with. And then, of course, invite them to your events, and this is a both sides of the aisle thing. So you want to make sure that you don't just pick your favorites, but that if you're having a luncheon or a gala or something like that, you invite whoever these officials are to come to your events and you acknowledge them from the podium. And if you have experience with this, you know that they never actually tell you if they're coming. They say they are and they don't, or they don't say they are and they do. And you need to have a staff person who's kind of paying attention to who walks in the door and can run up and hand a note to your speaker and say, Judge so-and-so just walked in, please just acknowledge them from the podium. What is advocacy? Advocacy is encouraging a policymaker to take a specific action. So to vote yes on something, no on something, to introduce a resolution, to direct the city manager to do something. And remember that you do it only after relating and educating, and when it's appropriate within their decision-making process. So again, this is just kind of about sensitivity to their schedule. You really want to avoid being the person who kind of shows up and browbeats them when it's not even relevant. So that's the time when you should just be building the relationship. And you should advocate when you're asked, because you're a subject matter expert, but even when you're not. So don't let them not calling and asking you kind of for your take on something be what keeps you from kind of offering your advice. Your checklist for these meetings is that you want to very clearly articulate the action you want them to take. You want to explain your reasons and perspective, both with data and, just like in fundraising, with a personal story of a client or a situation that will illustrate this. And you want to explain what the other side may think. And one of the great things that I learned from a woman named Katie Jarl, who works for the HSUS and is a very effective advocate for stuff that's important to HSUS for this kind of the southwest portion of the US, is that before every issue, say shark finning, she goes and meets with the other side to find out what they think. So she just has sort of an exploratory meeting with the people who would be her opponents, right? So like a trophy hunter. And she goes and talks with them and says, tell me more about what's meaningful for you. What is it about this piece of legislation that you're excited about or that rubs you the wrong way? And it actually kind of earns the respect of the other side when you go and you sit down with them and you find out what they're thinking. It also helps you kind of hear their argument so you can break it down and figure out how you want to kind of address each of the points of their argument. And I think that when you can go to a policymaker and explain what the other side may think, having said that you met them, it says something about you. One, that you're doing some intelligent research, but also I think that the way that the other side, very often in animal welfare, would like to convey us is as kind of the crazy cat lady, right? Like a person who's kind of has kittens stuck to her and is overrun. And if we are being strategic enough to meet with the opposition, to go in with research and documented facts about the position we're advocating for, if we can say, I've talked with the other side, I know what they're going to say, here's my counterpoint, and it's all very professional and civil, then we are owning the narrative and nobody can kind of define us as kind of crazy, emotional, reactive animal people, right? So doing all of this kind of groundwork in advance gives us credibility that, let's face it, sometimes as an industry, we are not given automatically. When you meet with somebody who is supportive and is an issue leader, you want to ask who else they can broker a meeting with. You're doing that kind of throughout the relationship. And then you want to ask them, what could I do that would make it easier for you to pass this? So sometimes, and this happened often when I was lobbying for affordable housing, we'd meet with somebody and they'd say, like, I'm just not hearing enough about it. There's just not enough pressure for me to vote one way or the other on this. So ask them, like, what's keeping you from voting the right way on this? Like, I know that you see this, like that we both have pets, and I know that you kind of share my perspective on this. Like, what would be the tipping point? And this, again, if you were in my last session, somebody asked a question about, like, what benefits should you offer a person? And I think you can be, for making a donation, I think it's okay to be really transparent and say to a policymaker, like, what would make you say yes? And then they have an opportunity to say, like, I need more data. I need a really pithy talking point that I can put on social media and look like a hero. I need to be the center of this campaign, and I need for you guys to have me do a press conference to celebrate if it wins. So it's okay to say, like, what would put you over the line on this, or what's holding you back from taking the action that we want you to. Does that make sense? So your to-do list is to go back to your respective places that have better climates than Texas, all of you. I can tell you're all so happy and none of you are sunburned. And you want to make a targeted list of policymakers. And it's important here to get familiar with the municipalities and who has the authority over the decisions that are likely to affect your facility, whether that's a shelter or a spay-neuter clinic. Sometimes that power is held with the county. Sometimes there's a judge that has influence over it. Sometimes it's a city council thing. Sometimes it's a state thing. So you want to kind of map out, like, who's likely to affect funding for my program? Who's likely to affect policy for my program? And then you want to make your targeted list. And as a reminder, that should sort of start with people, if you can't reach everybody, who are newly elected or who have already shown some activity or some affinity in your area of concern. You want to have 2 high-level staff, or it can be staff and a board member, own these relationships. This has been really wonderful for us because some of our board members are also big donors, right? So it's great to walk into our member of Congress's office and have him look up and say, like, oh, this woman just underwrote my campaign, and it turns out she also cares about this animal welfare thing. That can be very persuasive to have people whose names they recognize from the community or from their own donor list. You want to map out your relationship building strategy, schedule introductory meetings with folks. and then make a preliminary list of potential advocacy areas for the next 6 months. And sometimes there won't be one. Sometimes there won't be anything on the horizon, but that's kind of even better. Then you're just making the relationship to establish yourself as a resource for them, and they will have a trusting relationship with you that's not so front-loaded with the pressure of an upcoming ask. And that when that time comes, they will have already met with you 3 times, just sort of goodwill visits, or their staff will. And you will be the person that they call when they need to figure out how to vote on a particular issue. Okay, I have business cards. I realize that there are parts I may have skipped over here. So feel free to grab a business card and email me directly if you think of more questions about this later, or once you have the slides in hand if you want me to clarify something.
Thank you, Jill.
Thank you.